So outsider art is a term that makes me want to squiggle out of this interview. It's a very it's a distracting term. It's a problematic term because it distracts us away from the art. Let's hope that the apps and internet and web sites like Google don't distract us enough away like outsider art does from the actual objects and the makers. I think what we in America are accustomed to calling outsider art is self-taught art, but here in Europe we know it more as art brut. And art brut was a term coined by Jean Dubuffet to talk about raw art, art that happens beyond the walls of the academy. So you're basically talking about artists who haven't had the privilege of a formal art education in art making. Of course, not to say that self-taught artists aren't educated. They just haven't had a formal introduction to art making in their education. I've been involved with self-taught artists for, I guess, going on to 3 decades now. And my fascination with self-taught artists is I feel that in some ways they show an audience, a community, coming to a museum or going to a website or going to an art fair, that the urge to create, the desire to communicate, and the need to express is a human condition. And that it can be, that all of those communication factors can happen successfully, can happen in a moving way, and can be meaningful even if you haven't gone to a university for a fine art degree. I feel that self-taught artists can show an inventiveness that often is lost with an art education. There's a quote that Pablo Picasso is often credited with quoting, saying that he wishes that he could go back to being a little kid, a young child, and drawing as a young child. And really what he's talking about is that interpretation that happens a lot with self-taught artists, that the lack of education means they're able to tap into those real organic and deeply instilled urges that we all have, that we all can practice and become artists. Yeah, I would say that the general museum audience doesn't look to whether you had an MFA from Yale or from an art school here in Madrid, or if you learned your skill from your grandfather in a rural part of a country. But I will say the art world might care about it a little bit. So the community in which artists are cultivated and introduced into a market and brought into a museum setting or a private collection setting, I think that perhaps there's a little bit of caring there. And we know this because mainstream institutions like Reina Sofia haven't traditionally invested a lot of resources into projects around self-taught artists. That's changing. Just last year I had the privilege of working with Reina Sofia and Lynn Cook on a self-taught artist project around the Mexican artist Martin Ramirez. And that project was very successful with Madrid audiences. So there is still some barriers in the art world about the inclusion of self-taught artists. And what that means is that audiences often don't get exposed to it because most audiences will maintain a devotion to mainstream museums and don't often visit sort of specialty museums or niche museums like the American Folk Art Museum where I used to work. Niche museums classically have a much more restricted, restrained audience than, say, the Metropolitan or the Guggenheim. I was very fortunate and very young in my career was offered an opportunity to direct a new museum, a museum that had only been open for a few months, the Diggs Gallery at Winston-Salem State University. And the Diggs Gallery had this most awesome mission. Its mission was to exhibit the art of Africa and her diaspora, to exhibit the best art from Africa and African American culture, while using that art to address social issues, issues of race relations, racism, in North Carolina specifically. So it was this great place where we were asked to develop conversations around race relations, but to utilize artwork, painting, sculpture, drawings, assemblage to do that. And I had the privilege of being there for 11 years. I was new to the South and new to historically black schools, and quickly became passionate about historically black colleges and issues of race relations in North Carolina particularly. We put on some awesome exhibitions with artists like Ramar Bearden and Jacob Lawrence and Allison Sarr and Willie Birch. We had a dozen exhibitions a year, so we had a very active program. And what was pretty much felt by the time that I left there in the late 1990s was that we ended up becoming one of the sites in the community of Winston-Salem where people from all different backgrounds and different races did come and gather for fellowship, for communication, and for difficult conversation. And all of that happened around artwork by John Biggers or James Vanderzee or Ernest Withers and any number of African and African American artists. And so you can imagine for an art-based person like myself from Connecticut how absolutely seductive the experience was.